Welcome back to part 2 of my first regional series of the year, the Washington State Wine Deep Dive 2021. I'm of course Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis. Across the 3 episodes we will explore the terroir, geology, winemaking culture and wines of the US's second largest quality wine producing region, regularly ranked among the world's top wine regions. Guests are drawn from landmark producers in the Columbia Valley, the Yakima Valley, and Walla Walla, each uniquely placed to translate the larger story that each glass of Washington State wine represents. We continue today with an in-depth look at the Yakima Valley in the capable hands of Kerry Shiels. She is a second-generation winemaker at Côte Bonneville, based in Sunnyside, Washington State. Kerry tells us her origin story before talking about the first generation of winemakers in the region, including pioneers Walter Claw and Wade Wolf, before we virtually explore geological influences that predate those that we explored in part 1 of the series. We explore a regional point of differentiation with their vines planted on their own rootstock and the impact that it has on the final wine. Before we taste 3 wines produced in relatively small quantities each year and explore the winemaking influence of each. We first taste the 2019 DuBrul Vineyard Riesling, before moving on to the 2013 Syrah, and finally taste together the 2012 Côte Bonneville Bordeaux blend. Kerry closes by looking outside of the Yakima Valley, discussing the opportunities to try these wines internationally, and looks ahead for the region in the short and medium term. Enjoy.
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. This is a great opportunity to tell the story of the Yakima Valley and Côte Bonneville and myself. I actually grew up in the Yakima Valley at the beginning of the modern Washington wine industry. And my parents planted our vineyard when I was in middle school. I actually made wine in 7th grade because, I don't know, it made sense at the time. I needed a science project. Wine fermentation's fun. And so I made wine all throughout middle school and high school. But when you grow up in a small rural community and your parents do a thing and you're 17, you want to go see the world and do something different. So I spent a year as an exchange student in Sweden. I came back. I did my undergrad at Northwestern University in Chicago, so got that really big city experience. And I ended up at Northwestern. I ended up working a lot in the machine shop because I just like to make stuff. I wrote my thesis in the robotics lab. I built all sorts of things, sailed a lot because that was fun. And then I got hired right out of college by Fiat as part of a leadership development program. And it was rotational. So I actually started in London. I spent the first week in London and then moved to Italy. And I worked in prototyping. We literally built cars by hand in my factory. And it was so much fun. And then because it was rotational, I got rotated to a different country and company and function and ended up back in Chicago commuting, making spreadsheets and PowerPoints. And granted, I was doing some interesting work and it was a global role. So they would buy my plane tickets back to Italy every 6 to 9 months. But I really decided that making stuff is important and relevant. And wine is more fun than cars and tractors. And wine vineyards tend to be in great places and it's a global community. And so I said, you know what? I don't want to make cars and tractors. I don't want to go work in a factory in the Midwest somewhere. I don't want to live in humidity because I want to live where grapevines live. So I moved to California, did a vintage in Napa, did one in Australia, one in Argentina, got my grad degree at Davis. I worked in Napa while I was at Davis. So, and then I came home to the Yakima Valley, and having traveled all over the world and made wine on multiple continents and drunk a lot of wine in Europe, even though I never made wine there, you know, I feel really uniquely positioned to say, I strongly feel that Yakima is one of the best places in the world to grow wine grapes. And I I mean, I'm really lucky because my family has one of those really singular vineyards in such a singular region. And so it means I get to do things that you don't get to do anywhere else in the world. And it's, I mean, 17-year-old me, complete and utter failure. Because I wanted to not live in Sunnyside, but, you get smarter as you get older and your goals change. And here I am.
Could you maybe, just talk a bit about the kind of familial context, in terms of, what was it that kind of attracted them to starting this? Was this a huge shift for them as well, or is this something that they've sort of always had an itch that they scratched in terms of then planting the vineyard and starting to make wine?
Well, my parents got into wine. They were living in California in the 70s, which is kind of when Americans got into wine again. And because we were silly enough to have prohibition, just dumb. But they were professionals. Both of my parents are in the medical field. My dad's an orthopedic surgeon. My mom's a physical therapist. And they, being professionals, when they came to Washington, that was the beginning of the wine industry, because really the Yakima Valley is where it all kind of started. And so there were a lot of professional winemakers who had come up from UC Davis, because that was the place to get trained at the time. And there were professional viticulturalists, there were researchers doing a lot of amazing research, and those were that was the same social circle. And it was an interest of theirs. One of the reasons they came to Sunnyside is that my mom and dad wanted a farm. So we had Concord grapes, juice grapes, and they wanted to expand the farm and were interested in wine. So they started the wine grape vineyard. And at the time, the plan was to just be a vineyard. And when my little brother went off to college, they found themselves with the fear of empty nesting. And the vineyard was about 10 years old, and it had really established itself as one of those special, unique sites. And I mean, this isn't that long ago, especially if you think about the history of wine in general. But at the time, Washington had more 90-point wines than any other region in the world. And as soon as you left the Pacific Northwest, nobody knew where Washington was. Nobody knew Washington made wine. And so my mom and dad said, we have one of these vineyards. You cannot say Washington makes world-class wines with Cab Merlot Syrah blends, because you can't benchmark that to anything. So they set out to start the winery and make very classically styled wines that had context in the world of wine. So very traditional techniques, wines that were intended to age, wines with a sense of place. And that maintains our mission to this day, which means we still get to make, it's kind of an audacious statement, but somebody's got to do it. Why not us?
Following on from that, is it safe to say then that was actually quite typical of other kind of first generation winemakers of their kind of time, that people were really wanting to make those wines that were quite traditional and with a sense of place, which I think, are kind of buzzwords that we hear a lot at the moment in winemaking. I'm wondering, were they sort of outliers in a sense in terms of their motivations and the way that they wanted to show up in the world?
Oh, I think so. Sense of place is almost a newer concept. When we started the winery, an estate concept was, people thought my parents were crazy. And to do Bordeaux blends, oh my gosh, who does blends? Nobody does blends. Everybody does varietals. If you look at the history of not only the Yakima Valley, but also Washington wine, it really starts with Walter Clore, who did a lot of research based out of Prosser in the middle of the valley in the 60s. And he is when it started. And they were just looking at what would grow here, like what varietals do well. And he passed the torch from a viticulture perspective to Wade Wolf, who's one of the few people probably in the country with a PhD in viticulture. And Wade, he helped us lay out our vineyard. And Wade is still making wine today. This is so new I was in Argentina because I did a vintage there. And I'm thinking to myself, this is the new world. How long have you been making wine here? And my fellow enologists looked at each other and said, I don't know, when did the Spaniards get here? 500 years ago? Yeah, 500 years. That's how long we've been making wine. we're such babies. So there's so much, I mean, it's fun because there's experimentation. There's this sense of what works, like what grows. And for years, people were just trying to figure out, how do we grow grapes here? And so they would blend wine from all over the state, and people would make Washington wine. And in warmer years, you'd lean on your cooler sites, and in cooler years, you'd lean on your warmer sites. And people were trying to make a much more consistent Washington wine. And I think the thing that's really unique, and it's how we grow such great grapes and make such great wines, even though we're so young. I mean, we have the climate, we have the soil, but we've had such a focus on research and innovation and learning and education that it's really helped us get there faster. And the quality of wine continues to improve, and especially the quality of viticulture. I mean, what we've learned in the last couple of just decades in terms of water management and how to get quality grapes, which also ties into sustainability and all of these things, it's really exciting.
So it's my understanding that Yakima fruit can be potentially found in blends from all over Washington state. And how has that worked kind of over that development period that you're talking about there? And how does it work in practice now in terms of the winemakers kind of labeling the source of their fruit and as you kind of started to allude there, putting out this Washington state wine that kind of has its own recognizable character?
Well, most of the grapes in the state of Washington come from Yakima. It is the soul of Washington wine. It's where some of them are vineyard designated. Yakima is a big place. It's about 90 kilometers, about 55 miles from Red Willow over to Red Mountain. So it's not completely densely planted. But there are lots of grapes that it's part of the Columbia Valley. But within that, there's a lot of agricultural land. So winemakers, some of them want to come from Seattle, which is over the mountains, 3 hours away from Sunnyside, from the middle of the valley. And so there's a lot of wineries up in Woodinville. And there were some people who started making wine in Walla Walla. And Walla Walla is a cute town, and there's a lot of tourism. But for years, they didn't have any vineyards to speak of. And so they'd all get their grapes from the Yakima Valley. And they still do. I mean, if you look at a lot of the vineyard designates that people know of, DuBrul, obviously, but Red Willow, Boucher, Ciel de Cheval, anything on Red Mountain, those vineyards are all Snipes Mountain, Upland Vineyard, where some of the oldest grapevines in the state are that actually go back to pre-Prohibition. All of these vineyard designated wines that have been in wineries all over the state have come from Yakima. And for various reasons, sometimes people put Yakima on the label, sometimes they don't, but you'd be hard pressed to find more than a handful of wineries in the state of Washington that don't get fruit from the Yakima Valley. Well, the fruit that comes out of Yakima can be diverse because, like I said, it's a big region, but Red Mountain has a lot of structure. There's other parts of the valley that you get really, really brilliant aromatics. They can be so effusive, and they just really make wines interesting because we always talk about things like color and structure and phenolics. And yeah, those things are great. We love those, but you also want them to taste good and have complexity and aromatics and all those other wonderful things that make wine interesting. And Yakima has wines that are incredibly aromatic. And Yakima also has, because we have very diversified agriculture, we have a lot of very distinctive, unique sites. And if you want wines that don't taste like everything else, you have to start with unique, distinctive, interesting grapes. And so Yakima has a lot of those really unique sites. Well, with the diversity in the valley, there's different wineries that are looking for different things. And we can start at Red Mountain, and some of those vineyards like Ciel de Cheval and Heart of the Hill and Kiona is a classic vineyard that was named in the top 25 vineyards in the world years ago. And the wineries that source fruit from those vineyards are really looking for the structure. So Mark Ryan is an example of one that uses a lot of Red Mountain fruit. Mark is a big guy. His wines are big and bold and structured, and that's the perfect, I mean, he's a sweetheart, but he's a big guy. And and his wines are like him. And that's that characteristic that wineries that are looking for big, bold wines often get some fruit from Red Mountain. And there are a lot that are specifically Red Mountain. Upchurch Winery is another one. Chris Upchurch was the longstanding winemaker from DeLisle. Both of those wineries in Woodinville. DeLisle just got named, one of their D2 was on the Spectator Top 100 last year in December. And they get a lot of fruit from the other end of the valley. For example, they get a lot of Merlot from both DuBrul and Red Willow. And so from Red Willow, you get a lot of that mid-palate and structure and aromatics that you get a lot of aromatics from DuBrul. And that's a pretty big component of the DeLisle wines. DeLisle makes a Harrison Hill vineyard from right here in Sunnyside. Those vines go back to the 50s. And that's a very iconic wine. There are a number of wineries that do Boucher Syrah. But if we're going to talk about Syrah, we kind of have to go back to Red Willow because the Sours, with their collaboration with David Lake, brought Syrah into the state of Washington. And going back to the conversation of like knowing the pioneers, I had lunch one day with Wade Wolf and Jonathan Sauer, and we tracked the Syrah in my vineyard back to France. It just like, okay, your Syrah came from here, came from Red Willow, from this nursery, which got their clones from Red Willow, which got their clones from Phelps, which got their cuttings from Gigot. I'm like, how many vineyards can you do that in? It's so cool. But it really speaks to the uniqueness of, Syrah, when you go to Walla Walla, I'm sure you're going to talk about Syrah when you go to Walla Walla. And so there's so many vineyards and stories like that, and so many people like that.
I'm really enjoying this. As I say, I feel like, I'm getting that sort of, cultural, familial perspective, but then also, getting a deeper dive into the community around you, and the community that sort of fostered really the grape growing and the winemaking industry over there. I'm really curious now to ask you to kind of bring us right up to date and really kind of zoom in on your property there in terms of the DuBrul Vineyard. Mm-hmm. I haven't had the pleasure of visiting Washington State yet, only virtually through your Instagram feed, which is amazing.
Thank you.
So, please tell me and tell the listener, what might I see, hear, and smell if I were to head there and sort of stand out in that vineyard, and also a sense of how that changes through the seasons and across the year?
Well, what you would see when you come to the Yakima Valley, we'll use DuBrul Vineyard. It is a wonderful teaching vineyard, being in the middle of the state, but it also encapsulates everything that makes the Yakima Valley and Washington wine growing really cool. You are at the top of a south-facing steep rocky hillside, so there's beautiful views. You can see both Mount Rainier and Mount Adams in the distance. You can see the Snipes Mountain sub-AVA, and then further in the distance, there's the Horse Heaven Hills. You can see a lot of diversified agriculture. The next hill over is actually not even grapes. They're apples, because apples do better where there's more soil. So our hill has no soil. So we have too many rocks. So apples don't do well. We have grapes. And you go a little bit farther down the valley and on the same road, and you pass a hop field, and then you pass mint fields. And so we have all your beverages covered, beer, wine, and cocktails. But it's magic, because what it smells like when it's mint season, the whole valley smells like mint. When it's hop season, and there's a lot of hop processing in the town of Sunnyside. So I go home and it smells like beer. It's fantastic. That when the Concords, the juice grapes are coming into season, it smells like grape jelly. And it's really fantastic how these agriculture, how it smells like all the different crops at different points of the year. It's really a special thing. And what you see also depends on the time of year. We're at a very northerly latitude, so we have super long days. So you don't see sunset until 10 o'clock at night. And I'm usually sleeping for sunrise in the middle of summer because, I work winemaker hours, not farmer hours. But, conversely, in the winter, we have shorter days and things are brown because we don't have a lot of precipitation. But it's really a magical place.
Do you see, do you sort of notice influences from any of those either surrounding crops or herbs or vegetation? And you think that's kind of, that influence pegs us kind of right here to this vineyard?
I don't know. If you have a hop field planted right next to grapevines, you can have influence, but they're generally not planted next to each other because one of the things about Yakima, it's kind of similar to Burgundy in that you have vineyards planted on the hillsides and hops need more soil. So they're down on the valley floor. And so, and then up at the top of the hills, they have oak forest. We have no water. So there's really nothing growing. DuBrul's up at the top of the irrigation. As many of these, there's like a string of pearls of vineyards along this perfect middle band of the hillside where we have access to water from pristine snowmelt. And then there's kind of a gap between those plants that would be, those crops that would be super aromatic and maybe influence the wine. So, the apples are the things that are closest to us, but I don't think that the Chardonnay has apple flavors because of the block that's adjacent. I think that's just because it's indicative of the varietal.
You've given us the visual above ground, and yeah, I'm already building up a picture and what I'm sort of seeing there, and yeah, it sounds like a very sort of active scene really that's in front of me in terms of all these other industries and other crops and yeah, there's a lot going on by the sounds of it. I'm curious to explore under the ground, and you've already mentioned a little bit about the very rocky soil that you've got over there, and I wonder if you just take us on that sort of virtual tour of what's going on as far as you know under the soil, and also potentially give us a flavor of size as well. What is the sort of area that we're talking about?
Well, the geology of Yakima and Eastern Washington is fascinating. And last time Juan had touched on the Missoula floods, which is super cataclysmic. That's also fairly recent. So I'm going to go back a little further. Old Faithful, the hotspot in Yellowstone, used to be on the Oregon, Idaho, Washington border, the adjacent states, and it just spewed lava out. There was a series of lava flows, and it's 14,000 feet deep. It actually dented the crust of the earth. It's so heavy. So we have functionally volcanic bedrock, and where we're at, this mixed with the ancient Cascade volcanoes. So there's this interdigitation of different basaltic material. And that's the bedrock. And then Oregon, our neighbor to the south, is pushy, and they're actually rotating the state of Washington, which means we have due to tectonic plate movement and that pressure, we're getting these upthrusted hills. And the interesting thing about this is that our valley actually runs east-west. And if you think about it, most river valleys in the world run north-south, which means you either get sunlight in the morning or sunlight in the afternoon, not true south. And you don't have entire ridge lines of south-facing hillsides virtually anywhere else in the world. And so the higher up on the hills you go, the Missoula floods came after this. And as Juan was saying, the water would come, massive quantities of water would come rushing in and stop. And then that silt in the soil it had picked up would drop down, but that's generally at lower elevations. So the higher you are up in the hills, the less influence of the Missoula floods that you have. So our vineyard has virtually none. We're above that, but that's where those hops grow so nicely, and things that need more soil, more water holding capacity, more nutrients. But our soils are very poor because there's so much basalt that's underlaying those. And then in the middle of the valley, there's this really interesting band that went over our vineyard. But the ancestral Columbia River used to flow straight through the state, and it went right over our vineyard. And so we have river rocks from the Canadian Rockies, And the river would flow and dry up and flow and dry up. So you've got a white mineral, it's calcium carbonate. It's functionally limestone on the crust, rock crust in that part of the vineyard. And then when the hills were up thrust, it diverted the river. So it's currently an hour to the east of us on the freeway. So it's pretty far. But you have this interesting mix of river rocks at the top of a hill with calcium carbonate and a little bit of windblown loess, very fine dust that the wind has picked up from that's carried on, that is the main component of our soil. And again, that is a weird combination of factors. Like, you don't find river rocks on the top of a hill and limestone on the top of a hill with volcanic elements in many places anywhere in the world. So these wines are really unique and distinctive and different. And then we'll take it one step farther of what is in the soil. The interesting thing in the ground in Washington State, and especially the Yakima Valley, is we don't have phylloxera, so they're vinifera roots. They're own rooted. And there's only 2 regions in the world that do this. It's us and Chile. And when I was working in California, I was working on a project where we had it was a Pinot vineyard, and Pinot has a lot of clones because it's such a mutable grape variety. But we were looking at all these different rootstock clone interactions. And everybody talks about clones. Clones are not nearly as impactful to what your vine grows like and what your grapes taste like and what your wine tastes like as rootstock. But nobody talks about rootstock because it's super geeky. And it is like a whole level down the rabbit hole. Nobody talks about it. But it's super impactful. Now, when I was in grad school or in undergrad, we had a great Russian department. I read a lot of Russian literature. Now, I love Tolstoy, but it depends on the translation, right? So, because you get a good translator and it's fantastic. You get a bad translator and it's just drudgery. And so rootstocks are like the translators of the soil to the wine if you want wines of a sense of place. And so the unique thing is our vines being own rooted, it's like reading Tolstoy in Russian or reading Dante in Italian. And that expression, that purity of expression of that sense of place is not something you get in very many places. So it's really an interesting look of a sense of place.
That's without doubt the most poetic explanation I've ever heard of things being own rooted and the influences that it brings to the fruit and to the wine. I will say, based on the number of winemakers that have mentioned that, like, it does seem to be the thing that stands out. They know that it makes a difference, but they can't tell you why, or it's something that they'll just sort of, they'll kind of point to their gut almost, and that, it's just that sort of more intuitive thing. And it's not always something that, as I say, they're able to necessarily, put into words. That's really giving us the current state of play in terms of the vineyards, how it looks, what's going on under the soil. Then, take us inside, your particular operation and your particular sort of place within that ecosystem.
I think the winemaking at Côte Bonneville is really exciting and unique because we grow 6 different varietals. So, and we do that because there's most of our upthrust is south facing, but we also have a north facing slope, which is where we plant that Chardonnay that I referenced, and a west-southwest aspect with the Syrah. And so I get to make a lot of different wines. I make I think of them as white wines. I make Riesling and Rosé, which are tank fermented and stainless. They're cool ferments, more modern winemaking. Chardonnay is in a class of its own, very Burgundian traditional kind of techniques with barrel fermentation, full malolactic, Surly's aging for 1.5 years. And that's bottled unfined and unfiltered. And all of our red wines are brought in and fermented and destemmed and crushed and fermented in small lot fermenters, punched down by hand by me, sometimes mom or dad, because we're little. We only make 2,500 cases, like 30,000 bottles a year. So like all of the cellar work is done by pretty much me and my mom, and which is, it's a family operation. And some days, some people have to go to the gym during the fall, but I just go to the winery and punch down my ferments. And then they're aged in barrel, all of it's French oak, for a couple of years. And we believe that if you have really great grapes and they have healthy chemistry, like one also referenced pH, which is hugely important. We don't have to fine or filter the wines. We don't have to manipulate the wines a lot, because it's not about the winemaking. It's about that sense of place. And winemaking is important, but the more you manipulate and work the wine, the less it shows that sense of place. So our goal is really to have the vineyard and have that place show through.
I'm absolutely loving this, Kerry. This is such a pleasure to really have that firsthand virtual tour of the soil, of the region, of the geology, and really get a really strong sense of what you've got happening over there. And I think one of the things I love most about wine is that it then does transmit itself perfectly and seamlessly. Even though we're sort of 5,000 miles apart, we're here with the same wines on the table in front of us. And you've chosen these wines and able to, take us inside the glass now and be able to tell that story through how all of those factors and all of that experience then shows up in a glass that somebody listening might then be able to seek out and to try for themselves.
So the first wine that we're going to taste is the 2019 Riesling. And we make this in a Spätlese style. So when we started making Riesling, we benchmarked Riesling from all over the world. I had my personal summer of Riesling. And I decided that everybody talks about dry wines, but Riesling with a little residual sugar is so much more fun. It's so much more aromatic. It's so much more expressive. It pairs well with so many more different kinds of food. And at 10% alcohol, you can drink a whole bottle and still feel okay. Not that I've ever done that, of course. So we picked this one early to keep that alcohol and sugar and acid all nicely balanced. But the goal is to have expression. Again, it's fermented in stainless steel tanks with cool temperatures to preserve that aromatic integrity. And I think it just shows the fact that these vines really struggle. And there's so much concentration of flavor and intensity of fruit that I think this wine's really fun.
As if by magic, we're again trying a 2019 Riesling, as was tried last time with one from Chateau Saint-Michel. And he shared with me that 2019 over there was a relatively cool vintage, and that we essentially last time we traveled from 16 directly to 19, which was like time traveling from a super hot vintage to a super cool vintage. The growing conditions of 2019, then, how did they kind of affect you in terms of that sort of picking decision? Were you sort of picking later? Has the Riesling here and does the 2019 show something quite different because of those cooler growing conditions?
Well, I think the beauty of Yakima is that because we're a moderate climate, in cooler years, we're still warmer than cold places. And in warmer years, we're still cooler than hot places. So definitely vintage variation is important. And it's just, we don't have good and bad vintages in the same way that it never rains at harvest and you lose your crop, for example. But in a cooler vintage, as you would with cool climate wines, you expect more acidity. You expect with the Riesling, you get there's more of that citrus and less of the stone fruit. In a warmer year, there'll be more of that peach and pear. And in 19, which was a very cool vintage, we got a little bit more of that lemon and lime. And so it shifts the flavors back to a little bit more cool climate. But in terms of picking decisions, I pick things, we look at numbers, but I pick on flavor and ripeness. So I think, again, because of the fact it doesn't rain at harvest here, you have a lot of flexibility of waiting until things are ripe with the caveat that once you get far enough into the season, the days are too short and it's cold, and we have a much more like end date than in California, for example. You can let things hang much, much longer down there.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I've just pulled up your website with this wine on, and there are all of the descriptors that you've just said there. But then the very last line of it is get some before mum drinks it all, which I think is just a a brilliant descriptor, because it is, for all of the reasons that you've just described there, is just so drinkable. And the thing that really comes to mind when I'm tasting this now is, I think, still for me the most important thing in wine is balance, and all of those components that you've spoken about there, the acidity, the fruit, the residual sugar, just the drinkability, they all come together, and I would say, no one element of this is sort of over dominating, and yet, yeah, it feels as though it's just super versatile in terms of having it by itself, in terms of pairing it with a huge range of food, and potentially some foods that are quite challenging to pair with, or have spice, or are not, as I say, not the sort of most straightforward to pair. And I can imagine this being a particularly popular wine, and is this sort of one of your kind of crowd pleasers? Is this one of sort of the favorites of the winery?
Well, it's Riesling, so there's always this conundrum that people who know and understand and love Riesling love it, and then there's people who are afraid of Riesling. And to me, this is an exciting wine because I have had people come into the tasting room saying, I don't drink Riesling. And before we opened our tasting room, they used to come into the winery, and there was one group in particular who didn't want to taste it because they didn't drink Riesling and they didn't drink sweet wines, and they'd moved on from that because real wine drinkers don't drink Riesling and don't drink sweet wine. And I took them over to the tank and I pulled out a sample from the tank, and they were like, oh my God, what is this? And I turned them on to being Riesling drinkers, and it made my day. And so, I mean, we still have a lot of that perception that this is, Riesling is what you start with. And then as you grow up in wine, you move to Chardonnay, and then you move to Merlot, and then Sideways came out. And so then everybody had to drink Pinot, and then Australian Shiraz critter wines was the thing to drink, and then Malbec. And so, I mean, it really speaks to the evolution of the American wine consumption, but it's really fun when people discover Riesling and say, oh no, I do like Riesling. This is fun. And this is great. And it is an exceptionally versatile wine and so easy to pair with so many things, like you said.
From my point of view, from the UK perspective, it's definitely one of those sort of insider secrets within the wine trade over here, because I would almost say, along with something like sherry, Riesling is one of those things that maybe the general consumer wouldn't put it so high on their list in terms of, I'm gonna drink a Riesling tonight. I really feel like a Riesling. I think there are certainly fewer of those sorts of conversations happening, but definitely, yeah, I think a wine like this, and I think also, somebody like yourself as well, to actually put that content out there. I've watched a video on Instagram of you talking about sugar being left in wine, and I think, yeah, the idea of communicating and using Riesling as a kind of an example hopefully makes people more familiar with it, and they kind of understand why that sugar's left in there, and what the winemaker is hoping to achieve, which is sort of, I think it wasn't too geeky. These are interesting facts to know, and I think they do add something to when you're drinking. But I think it does also make that kind of hook in the consumer's mind as well, to make them think, oh, maybe we should be drinking a Riesling tonight, honey.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you like the Instagram. I try to make it educational and also show on the DuBrul Vineyard Instagram what the valley looks like and how it changes, because it's, to me, making making wine is really exceptional, not just because it smells good, but also because I get to make people happy. I get to teach them things. And like you said, sharing wine with people 5,000 miles apart that's really special.
I really want to just kind of say kudos to you because, I think you do such an amazing job of communicating about wine in an accessible way that I think at the same time doesn't patronize people and doesn't sort of, dumb things down for them. It assumes a level of interest and I think a level of knowledge. And I'm just curious just to sort of, explore a little bit about kind of that side of you. Is that something that you're exploring now through technology and having the mobile phone and being able to sort of, reach into people's phones no matter where they are in the world? Or is this something that you've kind of been doing for a while and this is just really me discovering you as that sort of wine communicator?
Well, I think with 2020 especially, and digital was the only way to communicate, I think that's really amped up the tools of which I use to talk about wine and teach people. But I think the beauty of wine is that you're never going to know everything. And you can be the most educated person on one aspect of the wine industry, but there's always something you don't know. And we are incredibly fortunate at Côte Bonneville that we have a very intellectually curious group of customers. And I don't really know how we got this started, but we have maintained some people are more educated than others, some people are more affluent than others, but everybody wants to learn more about wine. And nobody wants to just come in and grab a bottle of wine and drink it because it's just wine. They're very interested in the whys and the hows and the what makes it special and different and what makes our wines unique and different. And so I love teaching people. I'm one of the most highly educated people in the wine industry in general. I have a master's from UC Davis. There's not a lot of people in the world that are more educated, and many of them are working in wineries and they don't get to talk to people. Very few people get to do what I do, which is the full winery, the full bottle, and share it with people. And you throw in the education, and who should be teaching? I should be teaching people. It's my responsibility. So I love it that people listen to me. Okay, so the next wine that we have is the 2013 Syrah. And as I mentioned, Syrah there's a bit of a west-southwest facing aspect in our vineyard. So it's a cooler microclimate than the south-facing hillside that is the predominant slope and aspect, which is why we have Syrah planted there. And I pulled out the 13 for a couple reasons. One, 13 was a kind of a warm year, but it was also more typical for a classic Washington vintage. And I think this is a good representation of what our vineyard does. But I also pulled out older vintages because, again, I go back to the things that we did that people thought my mom and dad were crazy for, and we make Ageworthy wines. And you want wines to taste good when they're 10, 20, 30 years old. They generally aren't showing well when they're 2 years old. And so we hold on to our wines longer than a lot of people because so few Americans are understanding this or have the time to sell our wines or the space to sell our wines. And so we've held back wines, started from the beginning. And then once you get into that pattern, it is more expensive, but it shows the wines well. And it's what we do. That's what we're committed to. It's about our values. And so that's why we have older wines that have more maturity, that have more complexity, that are more interesting. So our current releases are held back more. I think on the website right now, I probably have the 2014 Syrah and maybe the 2012 Côte Bonneville. I change those up sometimes. We got some really nice press. We got a 97 points from the Wine Advocate. So I put the wines that they had reviewed on the website, and they're a little bit younger. So then I pushed them back to something that was a little bit older because, again, that's what I want people to be drinking. And so we also have the library wines because as I mentioned, we always kept that really nice big library. So we go back with the Côte Bonneville wine on the website all the way to the beginning. And when we started our wine club, we have a library club that it's only wines that are at least 10 years old that are sent out to those people. So again, it's been fun to watch the education of people learn about, when they drink verticals, they learn about vintage variation and what the vintages are in Washington. And it helps them figure out, do I like a warmer wine or a warmer vintage or a cooler vintage? What's my preference? What do I pair with those things? And that's been a really fun thing that we've only been doing for the last 5 years or so. So then the Syrah, I think the beautiful thing about our Syrah, as I think I've said about 6 times, is it's fruit driven, it's aromatic, it's balanced, there's a lot of finesse, but it's also got this really lovely floral component. I always find like a lavender or violet in this block that I just think is so pretty. And one of the things I love about Syrah is how it can be so pretty and pair so nicely with so many different things. And I think the 13 is a good example of that.
I'm again loving your descriptions. I think they're spot on. I think it was very interesting to me, that you wanted to be able to show the age-worthiness of these wines, and I can wholeheartedly attest to their age-worthiness. And I just think it's super interesting to kind of meet this wine at this point in its evolution. And everything seems to be supporting all of that. The color, I think, is showing that age, and I think the components for me, they feel like they're really sort of melding together, and they're sort of coming into almost like harmony. If I want to say that a young wine can be balanced, and certainly was balanced in the sense of the Riesling. I would almost say harmony, and speaking about harmonious characters of wines, for me, they tend to display themselves more with some age, and this is certainly giving that to me, and it's giving me really just another level of complexity, and again having all of those come together, all in the same direction, all in the same note, is really what you're looking for when you're kind of stepping up into that higher category and into that age-worthy category.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're drinking wine, as a consumer, if you're buying wines that I'm going to drink today that's quaffable and delicious and a nice glass of wine, there's 100% of places for that. But when you're looking for something that's special, when you're looking for those higher end bottles, when you're looking for complexity, the things I look for are wines that are interesting, that are harmonious, that are well balanced, that are going to age, and that are distinctive and unique. And I think that's what our wines produce. And I think a lot of that comes back to the uniqueness of the vineyard and the region.
Also very interesting for me, based on all of what we're talking about here, because it's super interesting to understand, I think, the market as well, and your customers, through what you're saying. I'm getting to understand your customers and what they're looking for, because, talking about that library club, that's kind of expressed in that way. That's the first time that I've come across that. And I think certainly all of the things that we're saying and we're kind of enjoying about this wine, they probably are for people who are not newbies in the world of wine. I think this may be potentially more challenging for somebody who is just, used to those fruit bombs and just used to those sort of more easier or more accessible wines. This is certainly a wine of depth and character. And I'm just curious, would you expand a little bit on that library club, in a sense, and kind of, is that a new innovation, kind of, bringing together, I guess, some of the more sort of committed, the more sort of serious fans of yours, and giving them another route to explore, I'm sure, some of these bottles which are not so often available nowadays.
My mom and dad never wanted to just make wine. They never wanted to just sell everything out of the tasting room on Saturdays and Sundays. And they really wanted to make those world-class wines. And so we never really had a wine club because we never really set out to be a marketing organization. We started out, we are still very much about the vineyard, about the land, about the wines. And we didn't even have a tasting room. We planted the vineyard in 1992, started the winery in 2001, opened our tasting room in 2015. And one of the things we were worried about is, we're in Sunnyside. There's not as much wine tourism as you get in a place like Woodinville that's basically in Seattle. And so we're not near any major population centers. There's a big mountain range that keeps people from driving over in the winter. But we were worried that we would run out of wines for our longtime loyal customers. And we had years of customer history. And being an engineer and a data person, I went through and said, okay, how do we take care of our people? And we had different tiers of customers. And so, we have people who think $100 for a bottle of wine is much more than they'd ever spend. But we have a club to take care of them because we love those people too. We have people who like the variety of the winery, whether it's red wines or white wines only. Who has a white wine only club? Côte Bonneville. Because we respect the people who like white wines. And like Mom said, she loves her white wines. She's going to drink them all if you don't get in the club. And and then we have those people who really want the best wines that we have, who love Côte, who are really dedicated, interesting. So we structured that. We structured all of our stuff to take care of our customers. And it's a little more complicated than, you get this many cases and this level of discount, and this many cases gives you this level of discount. But when you're little, like we are, I think the opportunity is you can actually take care of people. And again, I make wine to make people happy. It's not that much more work, and it's a lot more fun when you actually respect your customers and take care of your customers, and then they become your friends, which is fantastic.
Who do you want drinking your wine? I remember having this conversation with a master of wine over here in the UK, and he was saying just around, some of the prices of some of these wines are just so high that they're just going into collectors. They're not hitting the market, and kind of normal people and students and people who kind of would love to be able to try these wines and would really have a life-changing impact on them, that they're not getting a sniff.
Well, and I think that Côte Bonneville, especially, even though it's not an inexpensive wine, it retails for $120 US. That's not completely out of the realm of accessible. It's definitely, for many, many people, that's definitely a bottle for Christmas or an anniversary or special occasion. But if you have a group of students who want to get together and combine resources, it is accessible. And you might not be drinking it every night, but you do get to taste it. And I think as one of the benchmark wines out of a region that's becoming more and more important, I think that's really relevant, because we all started somewhere. We all learned somewhere, and we all had a budget that hopefully grows over time, but started smaller. So the third wine that we have is our flagship Côte Bonneville blend. And this is about 60% Cabernet, 40% Merlot every year. It's from the hillside vines that we were talking about, the steep, rocky, south-facing with those river rocks on top of basalt, with the calcium carbonate and a little bit of loess. These vines really struggle, so there's a lot of intensity, there's a lot of concentration. The New York Times has called this the best Merlot in the country, actually, which was pretty cool. It was after Sideways, when you weren't supposed to drink Merlot, and they wrote an article saying, no, drink Washington Merlot and drink it from DuBrul Vineyard. It's the best. So this wine is the 2012, which was a pretty classic growing season in Washington. We were about average for heat units, and it wasn't a drought year, so we had about average moisture. But the heat just came at the right time. This was a beautiful vintage. It shows what Washington can do. And again, these wines are intended to have some time on them. And so the 2012 is just, it's right. It's ready to drink now. And if you wanted to put this in your cellar for another 20 years, you can do that. But you don't have to. And I think, again, that goes back to respecting your consumer. I think there's something not fair about, I want you to spend a lot of money for something that you really can't appreciate for a decade. And we try to be respectful of our consumers because they keep us in business. It's a nice virtuous circle. We make wine, you guys drink it. We make more, you drink more. We keep playing. We all get to keep playing. It's super fun. We generally make about 500 cases of this wine, so not 6,000 bottles. So it's pretty small production, but it's one of our larger production wines. We grow more Cabernet and Merlot. Between the Côte Bonneville and the Carriage House, which is another Bordeaux blend that's grown about 50 yards away, but the soil is totally different. So they're terroir blended wines. And again, with own rooted vines, 50 yards with the same clones is really a fascinating side-by-side comparison. But those are the largest two. That's the bulk of our production. We make about 12,000 bottles of the Carriage House and about 6,000 of the Côte. And then everything else is about 200 cases, plus or minus, in a given year, which is minuscule. But again, that's that attention to detail, focus on the grapes, focus on what we're doing in the winemaking. It being small not only allows me to pay attention to everything that we do, it forces me to pay attention to everything that we do, because I get one block of Syrah, one block of Riesling, one shot with the Chardonnay. I mean, I have one chance a year to make it right. And I liked how Juan contrasted chefs get to cook every night and winemakers get to cook once a year. And it just really takes that up to another level when you have one tank of Riesling. Like, I have one chance a year to get it right. And I like working under that level of pressure. I also say that perfection is my form of laziness, because if things are perfect at the beginning and the first time and you never have to go back and fix any mistakes, that is my ultimate version of lazy. And so we strive for perfection. And I think it shows in the wines.
What that sort of level of production says to me is that you do get to know every vine almost, and you do get to know each block, and you kind of know what that's giving you, and it, you know, it creates the sort of mental hook for me back to working on a familial scale, you know, where you're working as a family, where you're working as that smaller unit, obviously with the help and expanding as you need to harvest and through the kind of growing cycle. But it's personal, isn't it, really, when you're on that scale?
I think that ties into one of the interesting things about Yakima. Within Washington State, Yakima has the most history and it has the most multi-generational farming families. And it really is important to get to know the micro nuances of your site if you're going to optimize your site. And there's such a difference in wine quality when you farm by driving in a truck around the edges of the block, or just looking at some sensors. You've got 2 or 3 sensors in a large block, versus the way we do it, which is, I mean, as you probably have seen on the Instagram, my gym is the vineyard and I run up and down the vines. And when there's questions I have in a certain block, I go do hill repeats. I'll go up one road, down the next, up one road, down the next. And you get to know things on a vine by vine basis, which impacts farming and the winemaking and all of these things. And those things you can't speed up. That just takes time, generations, attention to detail. And that's what we're starting to get here in Yakima, is that multi-generational, more and more of those multi-generational farming families, which is only going to make the quality of the wine coming out of Yakima consistently better.
So what's coming to mind here, when I pick up the bottle, I'm seeing Côte Bonneville on there. I'm seeing estate bottled. I'm seeing the year. And then I'm seeing red wine. And that's what it is. You know, it's obviously is a red wine. But I think this is one of those occasions where I just have a big smile on my face, as you can probably hear and as you can see. But it just makes me think really about that label that we put on wine, red wine, and that can mean so many things to different people. And I just wish that the people listening now could smell what I'm smelling and could taste what I'm tasting, because it's like there is just, I like to talk about wines containing information. For me, that is the metaphor that makes the most sense with wines for me, is that if I'm smelling a wine, does it take me closer to that site? Does it have those different layers? Does it have that kind of what I call a 3D nose, where you've got so many different layers and so much detail of fruits and of flowers and of petals, and then that following through into the mouth and into the finish. And I'm getting all of that from this wine. It's really showing me, I think, so much about the site, about you as producers, and about the broader region as well. It's absolutely stunning, and I think it's such an important point that you raised there around that price accessibility. And I think it is the wine that, if you see it there and you're not normally spending that much on a bottle of wine, I really think that it's worth, having for that special occasion, having for that special meal. And I don't think that a wine like this could disappoint anybody. It's stunning, really is. I think now that we've tasted all of these 3 wines, I was sort of holding back on a question, and I probably hinted at it there in my description of the red wine. Is really to ask about the brand, because when I opened the box that you sent and I pulled these bottles out, I really got that strong sense of history on that same Yakima Valley red. I kind of see the stamp carrying Côte Bonneville, Napoleon DuBrul, established 1902. Could you just unpick a little bit around what that brand kind of represents, and what are some of these images and these names that people are likely to see when they look at these bottles?
The vineyard is named DuBrul Vineyard, as we've talked about, and that's named after Napoleon DuBrul, my great-great-grandfather, and that side of the family. Now, Napoleon built this Côte Bonneville estate. He named it Côte Bonneville after his adopted city, which was actually in Ohio in the Midwest. But it's a very interesting, it was an innovative building at the time. Built in 1902, it has passive air conditioning, and it used locally sourced materials, and just a really interesting house. Every facet is different. Right behind the main house is the carriage house, which is where my mom and dad actually got married. It was a convent at the time. And so the vineyard was DuBrul Vineyard. And we were one of the first vineyards in Washington to get vineyard designated and have DuBrul Vineyard put on other people's bottles. And we still get quite a few of those. Owen Rowe does a lot of vineyard designation. They actually moved to the Yakima Valley because of DuBrul Vineyard. They were founded in Oregon. But so to differentiate the vineyard, the brand of the vineyard from the brand of the winery, we wanted to be consistent, but not exactly the same. So all of the bottles are different aspects of the Côte Bonneville estate. So you put all the bottles together and you get a picture of the house. The Chardonnay is the entrance that you see on the Côte Bonneville label from the other side. The Riesling is a turret on the house. The Rosé is the front porch. The Syrah is an entertaining arbor in the yard. And then the carriage house, as I mentioned, is that structure that is adjacent to the main house. But you put all those together and you have all the different aspects and elements. And I think it ties in nicely to what we do, because it's not very straightforward, but it tells a really interesting story. And there's a lot of history. There's a lot of elements. There's a lot of complexity and depth that at one level is very simple, but it does take a little bit of explanation sometimes to really fully appreciate everything that we do.
And I think it's great that you're here and you're in a podcast format, and you've had the time really to talk to that. And perfect segue into my next question, actually, because using digital communication and using a podcast, I know that your words will reach more than 100 countries out there, and there'll be people that will never have the chance to come and visit you, but they will hear this and they will want to try your wines, I'm sure. I'm curious, what is the place of these wines out there in the world? You've spoken before about the wine club, you've spoken before about the very favorable reviews and spoken to the domestic market. Are these wines finding themselves out there being enjoyed internationally also?
They have been enjoyed internationally. Hugh Johnson actually picked them for his wine club, and they went to a variety of 7 or 8 different European countries at one point. We are always interested in expanding into new markets, and especially on the global scale. It is definitely a challenge until we get all of those things in place. But if there are people who want to support these wines and import them, and then just give me a call. We can talk.
For me, really, the last question, but it's a biggie. So I'm curious to hear directly from you, Kerry. What do you think the big opportunity is for the Yakima Valley over the next 5 years? And I use that time frame really to encourage you to think about zooming in on potentially marketing or communication, something that's more around how people are communicating around the wines. And then kind of in a broader time frame, 20, 25 years, which may bring about other possibilities, potentially other elements of winemaking or even other grapes. So 5 years, 25 years, what are the big opportunities for the Yakima Valley?
Well, in 5 years, I think there's a lot of opportunity to tell our story and show people how unique that our growing region really is. I think through digital media, through podcasting and Instagram. I think through when we can travel again, it's really not that far and not that hard to get to visit us. And I think there are some opportunities in terms of really honing in on those senses of place. And I think as vineyards, more and more wineries are realizing that and looking at vineyard designates. So people are getting more chances to taste these wines that are grown in the Yakima Valley. A little bit farther time horizon, we talk about different grapes. There is an amazing amount of experimentation that happens in Yakima all the time. There are over 40 different varietals that are grown. Some of the grapes that are getting great recognition are Lotta does a really great Grenache from Upland Estates. We've got some Rhone varietals that Dick Boucher is growing, like Grenache Blanc and Picpoul and Marsanne and Roussanne. I think Syncline down in the Gorge makes a really nice Grenache Blanc out of his vineyard. And those kinds of things are always happening. They're not at scale yet, so some of them may grow, some of the other varietals. But I think really the opportunity long-term is the continued focus on research and optimizing our sites. It's the multi-generational just learning more and more about the nuances of any individual site and carrying that into the winery. And then I think as we look really long-term, everybody's talking about climate change and the sustainability of growing grapes in Eastern Washington. Yakima is the driest part of Washington State. We get 200 to 250 millimeters of precipitation a year, and it generally comes in the winter. So what we can do with irrigation through the snow melt that's captured in the Cascades is that we can really control how big and bushy the vines get. And much more important than being certified organic farming or biodynamic farming is having your vines planted in the right place. And if we can control pests and disease by site selection, by the fact that it's very dry, that you can keep your canopies small and open and get sunlight and airflow and really control pests with just natural methods like that, it is so sustainable. It really leads to where the future of agriculture should go, is appropriate site selection. And we're also in this wonderful place that's mitigated by the mountain ranges. So we're well positioned with a lot of climate change simulations. The simulations have us not seeing some of the major climatic variability that are already hitting, like Bordeaux and the hail that has happened much more frequently in Burgundy. And we're more protected from that. So we're already seeing a lot of investment. We have been for the last 6 to 7 years, both nationally and internationally, And people are really starting to look to Yakima as a vineyard region of the future.
A huge thanks once again to Kerry Shiels of Côte Bonneville. So great to be able to share your family's personal insight into the region. If you know someone who would find this episode interesting, please do share the direct link, which is interpretingwine.com/444. And if you found it really enjoyable, then do please leave the episode an iTunes review on the same link. Do see below for the website and Instagram handles for Côte Bonneville, where you can also catch Kerry sharing her knowledge in videos recorded at the winery. Highly recommended for virtual travel to the estate. And do be sure to visit Washington State Wine online at washingtonwine.org, at Washington Wine on Facebook, and WA_state_wine on Twitter and Instagram. Kerry's episode also sets the scene perfectly for the third and final installment of the Washington State Wine Deep Dive 2021, where I speak with Matt Reinvan of Reinvan Family Vineyards in Walla Walla. See you then.